At 6:12 a.m., I was standing barefoot on cold tile in my kitchen, staring at steam curling up from a mug of coffee I hadn't touched, when I heard the sound that told me this wasn't just another HOA warning letter, metal biting metal bolt cutters snapping shut on the lock of my front gate. The fog was still thick over the property, the kind that blurs edges and makes everything feel unreal. And through it, I saw 3 men in neon vests marked code enforcement stepping onto my land like they'd already rehearsed the walk. A few steps behind them, perfectly calm, arms folded, stood Linda Hawthorne, president of the Homeowners Association, smiling like the ending had been written long before that morning. I didn't rush outside. I didn't shout or wave papers around. I just stood there watching because by that point I'd already learned something important. When someone brings tools instead of conversation, this isn't about compliance. It's about conquest. My name is Ethan Walker. I spent 30 years working utility line storms, outages, emergencies. The kind of job where mistakes don't get warnings, they get consequences. When I retired, I didn't want luxury or status. I wanted space, quiet, and land that still did something real. That's why I bought this place in Maple Ridge Estates, 3 acres, legally grandfathered agricultural use, documented, stamped, filed, and approved long before the neighborhood grew manicured lawns and vinyl fences. I checked everything twice before signing. Because experience teaches you one thing, if it isn't written down, it doesn't exist. The first month felt like breathing again. Morning air that smelled like soil instead of asphalt. My rooster crowing right at sunrise, not aggressively, not endlessly, just announcing the day the way nature has always done. I slept better than I had in years. Then Linda moved in next door. She showed up at exactly 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, heels crunching on my gravel drive, white blazer pressed so sharply it looked armored. She held a leather binder against her chest and smiled without warmth. She didn't ask how I was settling in. She told me the neighborhood was modernizing and my farm was out of alignment with community expectations. That was the first conversation. The second came in the mail, a $200 fine for excessive noise. No warning, no courtesy call. A week later, animal control showed up after an anonymous tip. They walked the property, checked the coops, looked confused, and apologized. 2 days after that, I got another letter, this time about odor concerns. That was Linda's style. Never loud, never sloppy, just enough pressure to make you doubt how much ground you were standing on. At the monthly HOA meeting, she stood beneath fluorescent lights and launched a PowerPoint titled Community Value Preservation. An aerial image of my property filled the screen, barns circled in red, greenhouse tagged non-compliant. She told the room removing my farm could increase property values by 12%. No one argued. Some nodded, others stared at their phones. I walked home that night understanding something clearly. Silence isn't neutrality. It's consent. After that, things accelerated. Surveyors appeared on my land without notice. HOA violation stickers showed up on my door before sunrise. Linda started knocking on doors, telling neighbors my chickens were a health risk, that my land could trigger government intervention. The pressure wasn't dramatic, it was constant. Emails, notices, deadlines, banks calling to clarify risk exposure, insurance asking questions they'd never asked before. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table staring at the paperwork, thinking about how easy it would be to sell, to walk away, to let someone else fight this fight. Not because I thought she was right, but because exhaustion makes surrender feel reasonable. What stopped me wasn't anger, it was clarity. Linda wasn't careful, she was confident. And confident people leave evidence. I went to the county records office the next morning, pulled every deed, plat, map, and covenant tied to Maple Ridge Estates. And that's when the picture changed. Linda's property encroached onto common land. Her backyard structures had never been approved. Her sprinkler system violated the same covenant she was enforcing against me. Around the same time, my neighbor Margaret knocked on my door. She handed me her phone and pressed play. Linda's voice filled the room, calmly lying to a young couple about disease risks tied to my farm. Not opinions, statements presented as fact. That was the moment things stopped being personal and started being procedural. I hired a licensed surveyor, filed formal complaints, documented every trespass, every call, every letter. When I found connections between Linda and a development firm quietly acquiring legacy properties, I contacted the county sheriff. The final confrontation came during an emergency HOA meeting held in the local high school auditorium. The room was packed, humid, restless. Linda stood at the podium pushing for immediate enforcement, her voice steady, rehearsed. I waited until she finished. Then I stood up, placed certified maps on the table, played the recording, and let the room do the rest. The back doors opened. Sheriff Brooks walked in with federal agents. Linda's smile vanished. She was removed from office on the spot, charged with abuse of authority, fraud, and conspiracy. Let out past the same neighbors she'd taught to stay quiet. I went home that night and locked my gate from the inside. For the first time in months, the land was quiet again. And the lesson was simple. Power only works when people believe it's untouchable. After Linda was let out, the room didn't erupt like people expect in stories like this. There was no cheering, no clapping, no sudden unity. Just a heavy silence, the kind that settles in when people realize how close they came to being complicit in something ugly. I gathered my papers slowly. My hands weren't shaking, but they felt lighter, like I'd finally set something down I'd been carrying for months. As I walked out of that auditorium, people avoided my eyes, not out of anger, but out of discomfort. They weren't villains, just witnesses who'd waited too long. The next few days were quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. No emails from the Homeowners Association, no notices taped to my door, no white SUV idling across the street at odd hours. The sheriff stopped by once, not to chat, just to confirm timelines and collect originals. He told me Linda hadn't acted alone, that confidence like hers usually comes from believing the system won't look too closely. He didn't offer reassurance. He didn't need to. The process had already started, and it didn't need me anymore. I walked my property that evening just as the sun was dropping low. The barns were exactly where they'd always been. The greenhouse still smelled like damp soil and warm plastic. Nothing had changed except the pressure was gone. That's when I realized how constant it had been. How every sound, every letter, every unfamiliar car had slowly rewired the way I lived on my own land. It hadn't been one big threat. It was 1,000 small ones designed to make resistance feel unreasonable. A few neighbors started waving again. Not apologizing, not explaining, just acknowledging me like I hadn't almost been erased from the community's future plans. The Homeowners Association sent out a neutral statement a week later. No names, no accountability, just a reminder that procedures were under review. I didn't respond. I didn't need closure from an organization that mistook authority for entitlement. One morning, about a week after everything settled, I woke up to the sound of my rooster crowing at sunrise. Same sound that started all of this. Only this time it didn't feel defiant or dangerous. It just felt normal. I poured my coffee and stood at the window watching the light hit the fields the same way it always had. And for the first time since Linda knocked on my door in that white blazer, I wasn't bracing for impact. I wasn't waiting for the next letter. I wasn't planning the next move. The land was mine again, not because I fought louder, but because I refused to disappear quietly. And that's the thing most people don't understand about power. It doesn't fall apart when you challenge it emotionally. It collapses when you outlast it with facts.